You've now seen almost everything I thought should be in these films. I've concentrated mostly on tools to give you more confidence with speaking, but everything in here works just as well for written English, for example, letters, emails, reports and presentations. If you want to write a story, then there are a few more things you need to know. And if you're interested, there's a little more about this later in this film. There's also a little more about why you don't need these extras, these extra tenses, for normal, everyday international English, even at a very high standard. But first, I'd like to talk a little about confidence when speaking another language. I learned to ski when I was 40 years old. I was living in Italy at the time, and some friends asked me if I fancied joining them as they were skiing in the mountains. When I met them at the ski hire shop and they found out that I had never been skiing, they decided to have a little "let's throw the pazzo inglese down the mountain" party. I learned some very important things, and not just about skiing. You can't learn to ski without falling over. You can get some ideas from books, but you only learn when you're on your skis or falling off them. If you're pretty relaxed about falling, it usually doesn't hurt. If you fall over enough times, you can ski. I learned to be comfortable on skis by falling over 200 times in 6 days. I did most of my falling over in the first 2 days, but I was still falling on the last day. I enjoyed all 6 days. I still fall occasionally, but I enjoy skiing. If I'd been really careful and fallen over 200 times in 6 weeks, I'm sure it would have taken 6 weeks for me to learn to be comfortable. Now, I'm sure I don't need to explain the analogy. It doesn't matter if you want to improve quickly or slowly, that's your choice. But the more times you get on your skis and the more times you fall off them, the sooner you'll be skiing comfortably. Happy skiing. Now, a few films ago, I promised you a list of the irregular verbs I think it's worth remembering. There are 55, but as you will see, most of them are familiar to you. I will put a link to this list in the description. So let's move on. There's something else strange about must. The negative of I must, as you probably know, is I must not. The negative of I have to is I do not have to. Now, the strange thing is that I must not does not mean the same as I do not have to. I must not has the meaning of nie wolno. I must not forget my keys. I have to not forget my keys. I do not have to has the meaning of nie muszę. Now, this only really becomes a problem when you want to put I must not into the past. The simplest way is to say I had to not. I had to not forget my keys. Now this breaks another rule. But again, it's not important because it works. But the order of the words is important. Okay, let's move on. One more thing about questions. Now, obviously, as in many languages, including Polish, it is possible to turn a statement into a yes-no question by using the voice to make it sound like a question. You drank the whole bottle? The whole volleyball team was in your apartment? Unfortunately, this is not a useful habit because when you ask open questions, they almost all include a yes-no question, which must have the correct word order, which has to have the correct word order. If it doesn't, then you are not asking a question, you are making a statement. Okay, let's move on. Now here's a little bit more about the missing tenses. You might want to wait before you read this or carry on. In normal, everyday use, when we speak, our time picture is centered on now. You do it all the time in Polish. We live in the present, we remember the past, and we speculate about and plan for the future. When we write a story, we usually write it from the point of view of a narrator looking back and describing the events in the past. Occasionally, some writers have played with the idea of writing in the present, but most don't. This means that the whole time picture of the story moves to the left or back in time. The description of the action and events in most stories written in English mostly uses a mixture of column 2 past and time at a point in the past. Column 2 past is very common because the story takes place in a box of time, the time span of the book, for example. So, for example, on her way home from the cinema, which she usually visited at least once a week, she noticed that there seemed to be fewer cars parked in her street than she would normally expect. So here we have time as a box, on her way home, followed by several uses of column 2. Visited, noticed, seemed, parked. And one example of the general case conditional, would normally expect. Now, the writer had the choice to use would normally have expected, but it wasn't necessary. The sentence makes perfect sense in modern international English. Now, we'll also see had and column 3 again. Now, so far, in writing our story, we've had nothing new. But, inevitably, since the whole picture is centred in the past, not the present, there are times when it can be useful to be able to use the past of the past. Now, as we've seen, it's possible to reserve this for use with conditionals in the past. But for the author of a story, it sometimes makes things clearer if we know that they're talking about things that are in the past relative to the time frame of the story. Here's an example. She had decided to go to the cinema. even though earlier that evening she had felt like staying in with a bottle of wine and a good book. Now, the author wants to show explicitly that the decision and the feeling happened in the past relative to the time at which the character was walking home. So, he has used the option of what was known, when I was at school, as the pluperfect tense, which uses had and column 3. So there are two things to note. The first is it was an option which the author took as a preference, not as a necessity. And the other thing is that tense names were also obscure and pointless 40 years ago. So, why isn't it actually necessary? Well, even in the story, which is written in the past, we can still choose from the completely unspecified past and the past when it is significant. It's the choice between 2 and 3, columns 2 and 3, which we learned earlier in another film. The simple fact is that if you have a time before an event, then it is defined as being before the event. So the when is relevant. So if we wish, we can use column 2 again, and it still makes sense. She decided to go to the cinema, even though earlier that evening she felt like staying in with a bottle of wine and a good book. Of course, if you're a native speaker, then there's a stronger chance that you'll be completely comfortable with reading the first version, even if you hardly ever use the tense yourself. In fact, if you're speaking and your time frame is centered on now, it doesn't add anything useful when you use the past of the past. For example, you could say, I have worked as a journalist. Before that, I had been a soldier. But even though the first part is in the undefined past, so it's have and column 3, as soon as we say that the second part was before that time, then time has now become relevant again, so we can simply use column 2. I have worked as a journalist. Before that, I was a soldier. This makes perfect sense, and it means you don't need to know the extra tense, which of course means you don't need to make another decision about when to use it. Now, when you're writing a book, you might have time to think about that sort of stuff. You don't have that luxury if you're in a job interview. Okay, there's another example of a tense which is more useful to you in a story than in normal use. More useful to you in a story. It's the strange expression, used to. Now, it was tempting to include this earlier because it is popular with native speakers, but once again, it's not necessary. Let's go back to our character. She preferred the Roxy cinema these days. She used to go to the Odeon, but after it became a multiplex, she felt that it had lost its charm. Now, in this context, it's obvious what it means. This describes something that was the case, but is definitely no longer the case, in the centre of the time frame of the story. There are other simple ways to express this in the now time frame, for example. She prefers the Roxy cinema these days. She doesn't go to the Odeon because since it became a multiplex, she feels that it's lost its charm. Or, if you put it in the past, she preferred the Roxy cinema back then. She doesn't go to the Odeon because after it became a multiplex, she felt that it lost its charm. Okay, by now you probably realise why I didn't put this in all the earlier films. Now, there are other tenses I didn't cover earlier for very similar reasons. For example, in the same way as it is possible to talk about the past of the past, there are ways to speak about the past of the future. It's as if you put yourself into the future, then look back to a time that is before then. It comes in two versions, point X and cloud, and you can use the cloud version in the box future. Okay, here's an example. By the time I finish this project, I will have worked here for 5 years. As you can see, it's will have followed by column 3. Here's the point X version. By the time I finish this project, I will have been working here for 5 years. Now, perhaps before you die, you will have heard this tense used by native speakers. Perhaps before you die, you will hear this tense used by native speakers. Now, as you can tell from the last 2 sentences, you will not have needed to use it yourself. Please note, the information I have given about the missing tenses is purely for information, interest, and entertainment. There are others that I haven't even mentioned, and I haven't taken this part very seriously. If you want to make a serious study of English as a language and use it at a literary level, instead of simply being able to speak and write it with confidence, then you need much longer and more serious films. That's it. Have fun.